Hello, welcome to the Ideas Sleep Furiously podcast. I'm Matt Archer. Today I'm speaking with Anthony Magnabosco. Anthony is a skeptic well known for his YouTube channel where he practices Street Epistemology, hereafter known as SE. Like a modern day Socrates, he stops people to have random conversations about factual claims that they make in order to see if they have a good reason to believe them. His calm demeanour and ability to set people at ease makes for a wonderful antidote to a world of Shapiro DESTROYS SJW Feminist. And as Anthony says in the interview, he distinguishes between beliefs and people, an approach which anybody who interacts with him can attest to. In this interview, we talk about the tools that you can use to help deconstruct arguments, both your own and other people's, and the future of sense-making movements. If that movement and these conversations are something that you would like to support, then you can do so for only $1 on Patreon. You can get your name in the credits and early access to videos. Check out the links down below for that. And without further ado, I give you the wonderful Anthony Magnabosco. Well, Anthony, thank you for coming onto the show. The first thing I want to ask you is to give a brief overview of your method and the intricacies of it. You've got these puzzle pieces that you hand out, where you go to find people.
Well, the puzzle pieces are not related to the method at all. It's just a gimmick sort of to encourage people to come back. So if I am able to find somebody to talk with me where I'm using street epistemology, I might offer them one of these three pieces as a gift with the idea that maybe they'll come back for the other two and complete it. But the process essentially is me inviting people to surface a claim that they think is true. This could also be characterized as a belief that they have. And I try to inform them about what they're getting into and obtain their consent. So would you mind if I asked you some challenging questions about why you think that that's true? And I'm doing this thing called street epistemology. And I'm usually willing to explain even more if they want it, but usually that's enough for people to say, yeah, sure, go ahead and ask me some questions. And then once we have a claim surfaced, I then try to tease out the real reasons why they think it's true. Oftentimes people will give a reason for thinking something is true. And when you double check to see if it's a reason that contributes to their level of confidence, they often say, well, no, I'd still be just as sure even if that reason wasn't there. You can keep repeating that until you find a reason that tends to impact somebody's confidence. You want to find a supporting justification that not only contributes to the person's level of confidence, but would decrease their level of confidence if they discovered that it's not true. Like reasons should work in both directions, I think. You don't just grab reasons just to bolster your review. Sometimes people do, they don't realize it. But once you've isolated the reason, then we shift into exploring how the person that I'm speaking with, not me, but how my interviewee went about deciding that that's a good enough reason to be so sure that this is true to that level of confidence. And that's the epistemology part of what we do. That's the how. It's exploring the robustness of the method that a person used to be so sure that that reason is a good reason for thinking something is true. And it's usually at that moment that people start to realize that they didn't use a method, or the method that they used is deficient in some way. Maybe they realize that they actually did use a really good, reliable method. But it's that exploration with them at their pace that tends to open people up to the possibility that their confidence might be misplaced. They may have over-justified their confidence or perhaps even under-justified their confidence. And they come to that realization themselves. I'm not telling them this. Now, sometimes people say, you've shown me that I can't back this up. And I always kind of cringe a little bit because I don't think I've shown them that. They've shown, I've facilitated the situation perhaps to help them realize this, but they're the ones that got there on their own. And that's what's so cool about SE is that it's about your conversation partner's views and reasons and methods and meanings of words the entire time. We try to take ourselves out of it to make it about them so that they can come to the realization on their own. And then they can decide what they want to do with that. And that's essentially what we do with street epistemology. And by the way, it's not just going out on the street and flagging down strangers to talk with you. Most people who use this wait for organic situations to pop up, and then they attempt to use it.
So obviously, this sounds a lot like what Socrates used to do. You know, going around Athens, being a gadfly, as he was known, and trying to, I guess, reduce things down to first principles. I'm not sure if pretending would be the right word, but certainly saying to people, well, I don't know. Yeah, it was just, Sam Harris likes to say, you know, the only thing we have is conversation. And I think, well, actually, really, the only thing we have is questions, right? Because there's so much information in the world. There's so much information that you could basically get justification for whatever belief you want, right? This is why you get I think there was a Netflix documentary on flat earthers, right? You can find a belief as crazy as you like out there. Whereas if you think about it as like the only resource you really have is the question, the power of the question, then exactly like you say, you can actually get people to a realization that maybe the method that they use to arrive at said crazy belief, or even something as this, I mean, this is what's interesting, right? Something like climate change. I think I could probably give like a B- high score essay defending the idea that climate change is happening. But if you put me up against a climate change skeptic, one of the 3% of scientists who aren't funded by the oil lobby, people that actually know their stuff, I would be absolutely demolished in that debate. And I think there's just something magical about that realization that even I don't want to say dogmas, right, but it's not that far off, right? The mainstream stuff. So obviously the thing at the moment is the vaccine, which is slightly different from climate change. But I think that's also that's the beauty in your approach. It's not just, I know you started with the and you still, your most viewed videos, I think, ones of a religious nature. But I think the beauty is applying it to our most taken for granted beliefs. Is that the way you see it?
I think I do. That seems to be where the strength of this method is the versatility of it, so that you can use it to explore supernatural claims like God claims, and if karma is real or if ghosts are real. And you can use it to explore people's positions on more pressing matters of our day, like mask usage, vaccine hesitancy, if Donald Trump won or lost the election or not. The big things that seem to be dividing us the most. Me personally, I would love to see people start using this tool for exploring those claims, because it seems when you provide people with evidence to show that climate change is real, for example, or if you have evidence that shows that it's not, when it contradicts our view, and if it's a view that we have tied into our identity as a person, if we feel threatened by information that is challenging us, we can often become defensive and ignore what's being presented to us, or we're very, very clever in finding ways to ignore it and discount it. Well, that's, he cheated on his wife, so you really can't trust what he says anyway. So all that facts that he's given me, I don't have to worry about it. Like, we're really clever at coming up with ways to ignore information that shows that we're wrong. And when you change the model into exploring how somebody determined that they're correct, it's all about them at that point. Now you can still run roughshod over a person and intimidate them or make them feel uncomfortable with a questioning approach. So it's really important to be paying attention to how your conversation partner is reacting to your questions. You don't want to overwhelm your conversation partner with questions either. Just like you could overwhelm somebody with data and facts to show that they're wrong, you could do the same with questions. So it's really important to be really locked in. Turn off your cell phone, take off your sunglasses, and focus. And if possible, get rid of all the necessary distraction around you and try to make it a one-on-one, and really try to be a mirror to the person that you're speaking with. And if you can do that, and then you ask these questions, you'll have profound discoveries. Oftentimes, even for the person that you're speaking with, they'll often say, you've helped me think more about my position than I ever had before. Maybe I didn't change my mind, but I have a much clearer view of my position. And now I'm going to probably be less likely to raise some of those reasons that I gave you because, maybe they're not as good, or I need to research them a little bit more. So the technique can actually humble a person to be a little bit more careful about what they claim to know. And that's valuable.
Could you walk people through some of your favorite encounters? Because I imagine that they might not necessarily be the same as the ones that have got 500,000 views.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. Some of my most popular videos, well, the most popular one is where I wasn't even doing SE at all. There were these two ladies who were doing a survey, and it was like 10 questions, and I was answering their questions. It wasn't even me questioning. And sure enough, that's like my most watched video, which is really kind of disheartening. But some of the videos that are my favorites, like there's one that comes to mind with this young guy named Jacob, who is a Christian, and we were talking about his God belief. But of course, you can use this technique with anything. I can give another example afterwards where it's a non-God example. But in this one, he was saying that he was suspicious about evolution, and he thought intelligent design made much more sense. And when we started exploring his position, it became evident that his standard for accepting evolution was extremely high compared to a standard for accepting intelligent design. We discovered that he potentially had a bias in what he would accept to change his mind. So we started talking about this discrepancy in standards. That was a really great conversation. And then he ended up coming back 4 or 5 more times, and we talked kind of off camera. And just watching that journey with him was just incredible. I've actually asked him, he's declined giving me permission to release those, unfortunately. But that was just a really powerful one. Another one was with a young lady who was making the argument that truth is subjective and that it's dependent on the narrative of who happens to be telling it. That's how you determine what's true, is the older the narrative is. And if it comes from an aggrieved culture that was maybe enslaved or something, then we should take what they have to say even more seriously. So if I have a container of candies here, which I do, you've probably seen these in our videos. If culture A says the total number of pieces in is even, and culture B says the total number of pieces in here is odd, the culture that has the most aggrieved narrative is the culture that's correct on that question. And that was mind-blowing to me, to think that somebody actually thinks that that's the case. How do you navigate the world if our narratives determine the truth of the matter? So anyways, that was a really cool non-religious one that came up. And I've had everything in between. You watch a few examples and it kind of dawns on you the versatility of the tool and the effectiveness in it in helping a person take another look at their certainty.
What's been the most challenging interaction in terms of, I guess you could define that multiple ways, couldn't you? When I thought about the question, I thought, challenging as in maybe it's pushed you on some of your beliefs, but I guess also I've watched some of those videos where you need some skill in diffusing the aggression, right? Some people, as you say, once you attack something like Christianity or specific belief within it, Jesus, was he the Son of God? People can be antagonistic, and I've seen people bring in their friends or other people that if they're street preachers, they'll bring in other people. I think that's one of the ones I watched, and actually I can't remember the guy's name, but he ended up coming back, and you spoke on a bridge somewhere, and that was an amazing second encounter.
Oh yeah. That was fun. Okay. So thank you for reminding me of that. I forgot about that. Yeah. Early on, back in 2015 or so, I went to the Alamo, where all the street preachers hang out here in San Antonio, Texas, on the weekends, to engage with the yelling, projecting, transmitting street preachers to try to use this questioning approach. And it was it was very challenging. And I would even look back on it to say it was a failure, because they weren't in a reflective, trusting mode. They were in this transmitting mode of getting the good news out of their belief. So that was really challenging. And then there was one guy that came up to me where we talked, and he was really just blah, 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 just keep yammering. And I was trying to get my questions in, and it wasn't the best foot forward on my part. And also, I think he probably had some regrets too. We ended up meeting a couple of years later, just having this wonderful conversation at the threshold of this bridge, and talking about like faith and do we trust the bridge, and all this other great stuff that came up. That was a really good talk. That I've had other challenging conversations, but usually they're not. The challenge isn't, well, what do we talk about, or what question do I ask next? Usually the challenge is, when do I wrap this up? Like, have we addressed this claim sufficiently enough to leave the person alone where they can then go away and think about it? So sometimes the challenge is recognizing when to stop the talk, so you're not overwhelming the person. Yeah. And you're ending on a reflective note where they can then go away and think about it. Because honestly, that seems to be where most of the change happens, is when the person is alone and they're then reflecting on the questions that you've asked, where the cameras aren't rolling and they're alone. Because they'll come back to get that second puzzle piece. And that's usually the feedback that I get, is, you really made me think. Now, again, did I make them think, or did they, I may have created an environment for them to think, but they're the ones that are reflecting on it. And for them to then feel comfortable enough to come back to be challenged further, perhaps, I take that as a good indication that what we're doing here is useful in some way.
Yeah, I think knowing where to end a conversation is an incredible skill, and a really important one to develop. Think about all the contexts where that's important. When you're engaged in an argument with your spouse or perhaps a friend, and I spoke about this on my Radical Curiosity video, but there are so many fantastic techniques from the world of therapy, especially couples therapy, where I think it was Gottman, can't remember now, but he and his wife, very, very famous in the realm of couples therapy, and they talk about, as do many other couple therapists, leaving the room, looking at your body language, seeing if you're closed off, having that time out. Often we forget that things like text is very hard to read the tone, right? So some therapists talk about using emojis to make your intent clear. But all of these skills, I think, are incredibly difficult to develop, often because you have to kind of do less rather than doing more. And I guess we'll come on later to what this has perhaps taught you about raising children, or what you think the schools could do better. I taught philosophy in for about 3 or 4 years, and I kind of had the opportunity to design my own curriculum for 2 of those years for 11 to 14, 15-year-olds. And I basically tried to make as much as possible the philosophical content. I tried to make that
accessible,
the forefront, accessible, but also the mode in which that was delivered was Socratic questioning, right? And the kids love it, right? Because suddenly they're empowered. No other subject do they get that. Do they get that feeling? And I guess the people, more conservative, more on the right, will say, "Oh, this is just the nonsense kind of the Deweyite education of the child, picks what they want to learn, and they don't really end up learning anything." I was like, well, maybe if every subject were like that, but there's got to be room for some exploration. If you're going to stick to your model of standardized testing, there has to be some room where the child gets to be front and center. I guess perhaps we could talk about that now. What has that, or what have you learned about what's wrong with the way people have been, let's face it, educated into their current set of epistemic tools? What could the schools do better? What have you learnt about your own, how you handle your interactions with your own children?
Okay. Well, there does seem to be a tendency for teachers and professors to simply teach and profess, and not create a classroom environment maybe where the students are encouraged to challenge the professor and question what they have to say. Or if the student says something, rather than the professor nod their head and correct them, maybe ask, what are some of the challenges that you find yourself getting when you reveal that position publicly to others? So talking about how we think about things could be really useful. And just very quickly at the start, you were noticing some similarities perhaps, or concepts between psychotherapy perhaps and what we're doing in SE. I think you were kind of hinting a little bit about that. I think there's something to that. I think what we're tending to do in SE is ask a lot of questions that get to a person's identity, because the beliefs that we hold and form are very tied to who we are. So there might be some similarities and approaches between what we're doing in street epistemology compared to SE. Here's a little bit of advice for somebody, whether you're in a teaching environment or you're having a conversation with somebody on the street, or an organic conversation with a loved one, is think, as you're having the conversation, think about how other people might be viewing the conversation. Pretend that you are both on a stage, or maybe you're watching a video later of this discussion. What would I notice if I was observing what was happening right now? That could be really useful in taking yourself out of it and objectively looking at the discussion and say, it's probably a good time for me to reassure them that I'm not here to change their mind, or that I appreciate their time, or maybe I should check in to see how are we doing on time. Do you mind if we go another few minutes? Or are there any questions you want to ask me in return? So being cognizant of the interaction that's happening, whether you're a teacher leading a classroom full of kids or students, or you're having that conversation, I think that kind of mindset is really helpful. How would other people be perceiving this interaction? Because that mindset, I think, can help you form better questions and make the conversation better overall.
So let's talk about those tools. I spoke about James Lindsay and Peter Bagassian's book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, in the Radical Curiosity video. What are your favorite tools for deconstructing arguments? And I guess not just that, but I also think about the state that you want to be in. I think I read an interview with you, or saw something where you said, I want to be very relaxed often. I want to assure someone I'm not, with my body language, I'm not going to pounce on them. Maybe even if you're thinking about what's my next question going to be, and you're finding it hard, you don't want to give off that aura. So yeah, not just those epistemic tools, but perhaps even as something as simple as, all right, I'm going to focus on what's it like to ground my feet on the floor right now and just be present in this moment. Do you have kind of a program?
It's informal, but I could probably give some specific advice. Like one of the first things you should probably do in order to be grounded and stay calm throughout the discussion is, before you even have the discussion, is be honest with yourself about what you're hoping to achieve. So when I go to this protest, and if I'm able to have a good conversation with one person who seems to be open to having a good discussion and being honest, what would I hope to achieve with that person? Okay, so ask yourself what your goals are. Another thing is, once you've found somebody, you can ask them if they want to know where you stand on their claim. That's a nice gesture, because sometimes most of the times people do want to know where you stand, although there's advantages in them not knowing where you stand, especially if you disagree, because if they think you're the enemy, then they'll probably be more guarded. But if you are truly trying to be open and upfront with what you're doing, you can offer that. And then sometimes people will give a claim, or they're sort of vague about what their claim is. Don't proceed with questioning why they think something is true until you're sure what the claim is. So I'll sometimes say, how could we phrase what you've just said over the last 5 minutes into a tweet? Can we phrase your truth claim about reality into a tweet? So get a very specific claim, then work out the definitions of any words that you might be confused on, and encourage them to do the same to you. If I use a word that you don't understand, please don't feel bad about asking me how I define that word. And I'd like to do the same with you. And then it's just a matter of figuring out the main reason. Well, assessing their level of confidence can be really useful on a scale from 0 to 100. How sure are you that this is factually true? So, and you can even calibrate it. So for example, how sure are you that I'm standing in front of you right now? Like that, 100? Okay, cool. Now, how sure are you that what you think about mask usage is true on that same scale? So now you've calibrated their level of confidence. What would move you up? What would move you down? What's your biggest reason for thinking that this is true? How did you go about doing it? But as far as tips, like those are the points that you want to hit, but pay very close attention so that you're not overwhelming your conversation partner. Because once you become aware of a technique like this, it could be really seductive, especially when you notice your enemy or somebody that you disagree with struggling to come up with answers, it could be really tempting to keep hitting them with more questions to show how ridiculous they are. Try to resist doing that. You don't want to overwhelm a person to the point where they're now becoming defensive and embarrassed, and you're losing the value of the intro of the exploration in the first place. Right? It's that introspection that is what leads to belief reflection, and belief reflection can lead to belief revision. So we can be our own worst enemies when we let our own ego and our excitement with what's happening in the conversation get in the way. And maybe another thing is give people plenty of time to answer your questions. So this is gold if it could happen. If you can ask a question and like, how did you come to think that that's true? And they take a step back and they're literally thinking about it, honestly reflecting. That's so important. And when we see it, sometimes we become empathetic to their struggle and we try to remove them from that period of awkwardness. Try to resist doing that. This is probably the one time where you do want to see somebody struggle a little bit, because that is ultimately what's helpful in getting them to take another look at their views and the quality of their reasons and so forth. So those are just sort of off the top of my head. We're writing a course where we're going to cover like lots and lots of things that can be done to facilitate these conversations, but it's not going as fast as we'd like it to, but it's going to be an incredible resource when it's out.
Well, this is a perfect segue then. Could you recommend some reading in the meantime for people that would like to know more about either these techniques or just useful reading for developing these skills? I mean, one book that comes to mind is I don't know whether you've heard of it. It's quite recent, I think last year, The Enigma of Reason by
I haven't heard that one yet.
Dan Sperber, Hugo Mercier.
Okay, and I got this one. I can recommend this one. This is yes. Julia.
Have you seen many people have commented on my YouTube channel saying you've got to read this book. Yeah,
I would love to see you interview Julia if you can. It seems like she's really busy, because I've been trying to reach her to see what she thinks about what we're doing with SE, because what she talks about in this book, this idea of the benefit of taking a step back and surveying the landscape and really being critical about the map that you're building in your mind about reality. That's all she talks about. And that's what we do in these SE conversations. So her book called The Scout Mindset would be highly recommended. And then you mentioned Boghossian and Lindsay's book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. There's a new book coming out by a guy named David McRaney called, I think it's called How Minds Change. And it's not out yet, but I think you can pre-order it. And if I'm not mistaken, he's planning to cover street epistemology in a chapter of that book. He actually came out and watched me do some SE, and we've talked. In fact, we did a recent interview that should be dropping this Saturday or Sunday, where we talk about SE and how it can be used for vaccine hesitancy. So check out his podcast called You Are Not So Smart, and then his upcoming book too.
That's fantastic. I'll put those links in the bio. Another one that comes to mind is obviously Jonathan Haidt's famous book, The Righteous Mind, especially when you're engaged in moral conversations, right? And having this useful vocabulary of the moral foundations. And some people are just going to be a little more, same with the Big Five personality scale, these things obviously overlap, but some people are going to be a little more reliant, like you say, on authority to justify their claims. And having that in the back of your mind, I think is incredibly useful, because one of the things I'm interested in is using this this toolkit to try to morally reframe. Right, so it's the same thing as street epistemology. You guess take a claim that's made by a conservative, so perhaps not as much anymore, but gay marriage, right? We'll take something quite obvious. Being against gay marriage, what might the justification be? Well, usually it's a religious one, right? It's an authority, right? The Bible. Well, if you use Haidt's framework, you can often use the same foundation that they're using in order to put a counter to them. So if you get yourself in that state of mind, I find that quite useful, right? So one of the ways you might do that, now it's not necessarily authority, it's more the loyalty foundation. This is another foundation conservatives rely more on. But you could say, well, if someone who's LGBT served in the US Army. How would you feel about them getting married? I mean, you're trying to then really get them to rank. So they've made a sacrifice for their country, and you want to deny them what seems to be a lower right, right? Fighting, potentially dying, and getting married to the person you love. What do you say about it? You put them in that kind of emotionally uncomfortable position, right? Which doesn't mean that there's always truth there, but it gets them to, I guess, deconstruct that from a more emotional point of view. I mean, I guess this brings us on nicely to the cynical, perhaps skeptical would be a kinder term, mindset of what you're doing, Anthony. It's just tricks, isn't it? You're just tricking people.
Well, before we get to the manipulation, persuasion, trickery question, because I think that's a good one that we could talk about, I want to just really quickly touch on the morality idea that we just talked about, because it does seem like the beliefs that we hold, especially if we think we need to hold them in order to be a good person, those are very challenging to explore with people to the point where they might consider lowering their certainty in the truth of it. Because what they think, here's the hypothesis. Haidt and others, including myself, I think that people will be less willing to lower or adjust their confidence in the certainty of a claim if they think they need to hold the claim to a high degree of confidence in order to be perceived as good or decent or moral by others or themselves. And I think it's really important to disentangle that notion that beliefs are simply things that we are forming, and we're probably not even aware in most cases that we're forming views. We pulled up a YouTube video, and by the end of it, we had 5 more views pop up into our head with varying degrees of confidence based on our personal experience up to that point. So a good question could be, if you ever get the indication that somebody is holding on to a belief, let's say it is a God belief, for example, or it could be anything else, it could be interesting to ask them how they think they would be any different if they one day realized that they don't have any backing to be so sure that that view is true. How would they change in any way? Would you start murdering people all of a sudden, or would you start lying more? So you can explore how they themselves would perceive. Sometimes they would say, well, yeah, I'd be a rotten person. Nobody would want to be around me. I'd be stealing and cheating. And then you can explore that with questions. And ultimately, what usually tends to happen is people realize that they wouldn't be much different. They would probably still be good without it. And that might be just what you need to kind of shift things just a little bit for them to realize that, oh, maybe this belief isn't so crucial to my identity as I originally thought. So that could be a really useful approach, is literally ask them, how would you be any different? Another good question is, what is the next best way to achieve this idea of being good and moral than what you're currently using? At the moment, it seems like you think you need to have a God belief in your life in order to be good. Let's say you discover that you can't back it up. What would be your next best reason or next best answer to that question if you couldn't say a higher power? And then that's usually where you get some really creative questions or creative responses. And they say, well, maybe I really wouldn't be all that different. And that kind of gets the ball rolling on it. But do you want to shift into some of the spicier?
Yeah. Well, actually, before we do, I guess this was a useful point to useful time to ask. Do you find that when you're speaking to perhaps college-educated, I guess that's a lot of people in America, it's not a particularly uncommon thing, but you can sense that someone has done their reading, they're switched on, they're particularly clever. Do you ever get different vibes from those people? Because one of the things that we know from the intelligence research is that people with higher IQs, that doesn't lead them any more to the truth, right? It just gives them the ability to find more elaborate reasons and to articulate them in a fancy fashion with polysyllabic words, like polysyllabic, right? to be able to I guess it goes back to that example that I mentioned previously. You put me in a room with a climate scientist who's one of the few. I'm just going to be demolished, right? And I imagine I don't want to romanticize it too much, but I get the sense that maybe someone with as much experience as you, maybe there's often more to be said for speaking to someone who has just come to their views not through a sophisticated process of I'm going to basically indulge in confirmation bias and read everything against climate change, but has just been like, oh well, I read the Bible. Right? There's often perhaps more rewarding experiences to be had there, but maybe I'm projecting.
Well, the part that stuck out to me the most in what you just said was this idea of the different types of people that you'll encounter. So I can go to a college campus or a trail and meet somebody who studied the claim that they're making for 10 years and they're really well versed on it and they literally teach it. Or I can run into somebody who has they just recently discovered it. It's a recent view and they're a little bit softer in their commitment to it. But it doesn't, I want to say it almost doesn't matter when you use this approach, but in a way it does, because the person who is more sure in their position because they've done more research on it can come across as cocky, and that cockiness can be translated by the questioner. It could rub the questioner the wrong way. Let's just put it that way. It's like, look at this cocky guy, who does he think he is? Yeah. So it could end up triggering your own ego as the questioner. But the types of questions that I would ask or the way that I would approach it would be pretty much the same, whether it was a novice or an expert in the field. And you were saying, like, you think that if you were to walk up to somebody who was well-versed in climate change, could clobber you with data. Maybe they could. But when you're using this approach, you don't need to know much about the topic at hand. They're the experts. All you need to know is, how do I explain what I'm doing in a way that incentivizes the person to want to talk with me and be honest about what I'm doing, and then try to figure out questions to explore how they became convinced. So it could be rather intimidating to talk with people about topics that you know nothing about. But with this approach, it's arguable that it could be advantageous to not know much about it, because you can ask a very simple question in the mind of an expert, but it was a profound question because now you have a better understanding of what they mean by climate change, for example, like a term. And they themselves, in the process of explaining to you what they mean by that term, may have actually helped them because it's such a basic thing that they've never considered. And now you're challenging them to structure it in a sentence that you can consume. There's value in that. And then that can actually lead to you asking better questions of them. So what I found is that people who are well-versed in topics just take more time because they often feel pressure to give you all the facts to justify their views when you're only interested in specific ones that contribute to their level of confidence. And so it's a little bit of a game changer. I wish I actually had more conversations with experts to show the difference, because most of the people that I record are regular everyday people walking by in my community. And I don't know what I'm going to get. Every once in a while I get an expert, but most often these are just lay people who have these views. I would like to see more examples of people using street epistemology with experts. But what I think you'll notice is that it wouldn't be much different when it was all said and done.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because I wanted to, before we get on to audience questions, ask you about the future of this movement and adjacent movements. And that's kind of the project here, on this channel, to certainly with the podcast, to get people down to first principles. There are people. Okay, I'm gonna tell a bit of an anecdote. So in the UK, we've got a left-wing Guardian columnist, one of the few left-wing papers, called Owen Jones. He's got about 1 million Twitter followers, and he's a bit Marmitey, right? You kind of either love him or you hate him. And he started interviewing people from across the political spectrum, right? And he interviewed a few years ago a conservative journalist called Peter Hitchens, who's also very popular and I think he's in his early 70s now. And they put a 15-minute clip up. It went viral. I think it got over 1 million views. And people were saying, release the whole thing, release the whole thing. And they did, and that was even more successful. And I was thinking recently, the reason that I think this has, not just that particular video, but the videos like it, right? The yearning for the long-form conversation. Obviously, there are multiple reasons why this is taking off, but I think the artificial concision of the media, saying things in between 5-minute ad breaks. People are sick of that now. They realise that this is, an analog model. It's dead. And for the first time, they were presented with, oh, this is what an actual conservative is. Right? Pete Hitchens has long said the Conservative Party in the UK, there's nothing conservative about them. The old Evelyn Waugh quote, they've not put the clock back a minute since they've been in power. And Owen Jones is a proper leftist. He's left of the Labour Party, even under Jeremy Corbyn. And suddenly these two people, they weren't necessarily open-minded, but they were very cordial. And the audience got a glimpse of, oh, the Overton window isn't this. It's actually a lot wider. And in truth, it's even wider than that. Right? There are anarchists and there are people, I guess, perhaps further right than Pete Hitchens than we might want to give a platform to. But if only to understand how they come to that position to, I guess, help people avoid going down that route, it might be a wonderful thing to do. So it's something that I'm very much interested in, and I would love to see you explore that more on your channel, whether it's a roundtable, one-on-one. But yeah, experts and the first principle street epistemology approach, I think, could be the future.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are probably discouraged by watching the little clips on the news where it's almost, maybe it is even propaganda, because they're just telling their views with very little pushback. And there is a hunger for the long form conversation. Like, I find that encouraging, particularly because when I first went out, I was specifically given advice: keep these really short, put a 5-minute timer, and you got to get this under like 4 minutes, 5 minutes, because nobody's going to watch it. And I set out to do that. But if you watched a number of videos, you usually know when the timer beeps, if I even set the timer, because oftentimes I forget to even start it. But usually when the timer goes off at 5 minutes, both of us are enjoying the talk so much we want to keep it going. And I wasn't really sure how the audience would react to a 40-minute video on my YouTube channel. And I haven't really looked at the stats to see, well, are people bailing at the 16-minute mark, or are they staying to the very end? My sense is they're probably still bailing, honestly. But I do think, and maybe these conversations are better in audio form in a podcast as opposed to a video where you have to watch.
Yeah,
I think more
just
people
on that
probably
point,
listen.
The idea of them bailing, I don't think that's necessary. I think for your content, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think that if you watch 30 minutes of a 60-minute video, you get a lot of value out of that. When it's street epistemology, it's not necessarily like a Jordan Peterson interview with
you might be right.
someone on psychedelics.
Like, maybe
I want more info.
Yeah, maybe they didn't need to stick around to the last 3 minutes where that big question was asked and that big moment of reflection. Like, that was all building up to that. But of course, yeah, there's lots of things that were happening prior to it. He explained what he was doing. They built a little rapport. They struggled a little bit to figure out what the claim was. Ooh, they finally got it. Oh, they hit this little hiccup where they were talking past each other because they had this different meaning of words. Oh, now they've talked about methodology. Like, there's a lot that's covered in these things that's still useful. I think I agree. Like, you don't have to watch the entire thing, but I think people they like people taking the time to explain their nuanced perspectives. And if you can embed that with challenging questions, that is extremely educational and entertaining from my point of view. Like, I don't enjoy watching debates where people are arguing and yelling and giving facts to each other. I would much rather watch an interview like you've just outlined, or the ones that you see in SE, where there's this really meaningful connection about a sensitive topic that two parties disagree with, and they made progress seemingly. And it seemed like that person maybe went away thinking about it more than they did at the start of it. Like, that person might be on their way to changing their mind. I've never seen anything like that in a conversation. That's what's usually plays out in these SE interactions, and that's valuable. I wish that was more desirable and entertaining for people than the conflict that we tend to see in most of the interactions today.
Yeah, well, I'm maybe this is too optimistic, but I do think that the energy that brings someone to Ben Shapiro Destroys SJW Feminist,
I can't watch a
5-minute clip.
I can't even watch them.
That low energy, I really hope that can be right. The high energy version of that is street epistemology. Right, it's someone
High
actually
energy?
using. Yeah, so perhaps not high energy is perhaps that's the wrong phrase, but So it's cheap, right? It's fast food. The Ben Shapiro stuff is fast food, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And what
Oh, I
street
see.
epistemology is getting someone to find the holes in their own argument. So if you just take away the destroys idea and actually reflect, use it on yourself, like, oh, well, how could I be wrong? Wouldn't it be amazing, right? I mean, he would probably lose a lot of
Here's the irony too, is that sometimes in an SE conversation, you've made more progress with your conversation partner than the destroying Ben Shapiro ever would have made.
Yeah.
So it could be
Absolutely.
tempting to want to phrase or title my videos in a very salacious, clickbaity way. Like, atheist destroys Christian could be a title of an SE video, but it kind of flies in the face of what it is ultimately what we're trying to do with the tool. So sometimes we might be handicapping ourselves by not taking the more salacious, in your face route when we try to promote the conversations that we're having. But I'm hopeful that people will look beyond that and like really see what's happening here, and that this is an empathetic inquiry of ideas, and there's something to it. And I'm willing to invest the time necessary to really understand what's happening in this interaction.
Before we go on to audience questions, there was one more thing I wanted to touch on. You're doing this for a YouTube channel, but obviously I imagine this bleeds into your real life. How do you decide when to engage? I'll give you an example. One of the comments that I've gotten on my YouTube channel, or when I've promoted it on Reddit, is I've got this salt lamp, right? And there's also a phrenology head, right? And a Noam Chomsky drawing that a former student did for me. Quite an eclectic mix. And one of the comments, it was hilarious. It was salt lamp, phrenology head, Chomsky portrait, I'm out. I thought that's perfect, right? Because if you're out that easy, if that's all it takes, then I don't really want you watching the videos, right? It's a good filtration system. But then at the same time, you kind of you want to explore that, but it's a cost benefit analysis. We don't have all the time in the world to convince anyone that's going to, if they're going to go out that quickly. You can't be like, wait, do you think that I actually believe that the salt lamp is giving me some therapeutic benefit?
Right.
So where do you draw that line?
Okay, so if it was a comment on one of my videos, which I can definitely relate to, because that is exactly the kind of comment that somebody might say, like, Anthony said this, does he really think that? Boy, he's not as much of a skeptic as I really thought. Like, there's literally a thread in one of my videos today, because I think I said I was like 1% on a scale from 1 to 100 on some claim. And my reason was because, well, lots of people believe it, which I admit is a bad reason, but I'm being honest. I mean, then I wonder, like, well, is this worth my time to explain my position? Or, I know that I've covered this in other interviews like this that I've done. Is this really a battle that I want to have? Or is it likely, if I just let that sit, somebody who watches my channel likely has seen me do the interview and they know the nuance of my position, they can probably answer it for me. That's usually what I do now, is I just sort of let it sit there, and then usually somebody else will respond to it on my behalf, and they're pretty close to it. But you kind of have to choose your battles, and you have to try to pick what's the best use of your time. So sometimes there is a really good question on my channel. Like, somebody will ask, like, this seems like manipulation or persuasion, maybe to kind of circle back to that if we want to. I might take the time to explain why I don't think that it is, because it's a great question. It's a common question. And if I don't address it, it might look suspicious, like I'm hiding it or I don't have an answer to it. So it's just, I try to evaluate what's the best use of my time for that type of stuff.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a more sophisticated answer, is there? Time is short. Okay, so audience questions, speaking of. This is from the Street Epistemology Facebook group. Bo Nelson asks, have you always had a calm and collected demeanour throughout your life, or did you need to work on it for the sake of SE?
I didn't always have it. When I was a kid, I was this really kind of anxious, twitchy kid. Like, I had little verbal tics and stuff. And it was probably because of, like, as I'm thinking back on it, it was probably because of my anxiety about thinking that there was a higher power watching over me and not getting sufficient answers from the adults about it. So I was always kind of an anxious kid who hated public speaking, by the way. Like, when I was taking a speech class, I remember carrying a tack in my pocket. I was thinking, I'm going to train myself not to be nervous. So like every time I felt myself getting nervous, I would jam the tack into like in my pocket into my thigh. How stupid was that? What was I even trying to do? But
I
I got
drank, I think, a half bottle of vodka before a public presentation at university.
I
So
don't and that's the worst thing that you can do, because now you're worried that somebody's going to notice that you're drunk, which only adds to the anxiety. So yeah, I would do that. I would mix vodka with orange juice in the morning before going to my speech class. It was horrible. But anyway, there's been tremendous growth from that. If you look at the earlier videos where I went to the Alamo to talk to the street preachers, I was debating and arguing with them about their Bible verses and that they're foolish for taking this on faith. And I was doing counter apologetics with them because that's what I was comfortable with. Even though I knew that I was learning this different approach, it didn't quite dawn on me that was holding me back. So it was this iterative process of conversing with people, recording the conversations, putting them on YouTube, paying attention to the feedback, and then seriously asking myself, how do I want to improve at this? Do I want to improve at this? Am I comfortable being the argumentative person, or do I want to be the more compassionate inquisitor? And the compassionate inquisitor was more in my style, like it fit me, but I didn't even know it was an option to try on, until I discovered it, because all I saw was what you see on the news, short little clips of people arguing, arguments between theists and atheists, for example. And I didn't even know that there was an alternate way of talking with people about sensitive topics. And that whole journey is played out in my videos, by the way. Like, just pull up the oldest video you can find and take it with a grain of salt, because it's bad. But I think you can see the growth. So no, I wasn't always that way.
yeah, absolutely. Naomi Forster says, are there any beliefs you find too unpleasant or offensive to be able to discuss using SE?
None.
And why is that?
Because I make a distinction between people and beliefs, that people walk around with beliefs that they've acquired. And I can discard a belief or lower my confidence in the truth of it and still be a person. So beliefs are disposable in a way. Like, we shouldn't be scared by beliefs or the claims that people make. We should be intrigued by them to the point of wanting to explore it with them. So there's not really many topics. I can't think of a topic that I wouldn't want to explore, unless it was something like, let's say I had a kid who was attacked by a dog when she was 4 and she was killed. Well, maybe I don't want to talk about the ethics of raising pit bulls or some other breed that maybe has a history of attacking people, right? It might be just too sensitive for me, but that would be rare. Like, I don't think that there are many topics that I wouldn't want to explore with people.
What about whether you should put pineapple on pizza?
See, okay, well, let's make a distinction. There are some views that are opinions. That sounds like it's a personal opinion. Now, if you said, if you add pineapple to pizza, it actually increases your libido or something, now we have a fact claim that we can explore. I'd be happy to explore that. But whether you think pineapple is delicious on pizza, that's a personal opinion. It's almost like listening to somebody tell their dream. I have very little interest in it. I glaze over when my family wants to tell me their dream stories, or friends. I just, why are you telling me something that only happened in your head and has no bearing on reality whatsoever? Okay, I'll humor you. What happened in your dream? It's the same thing with pineapple on pizza or opinions in general. I want to use this questioning technique of SE on claims that you think are factually true in reality, because it inspires us to behave and act out on them. And it also usually tends to want us to have other people believe it too. Now, I know that there are some people who are really fond of pineapple on pizza, but they don't usually go so far as to say everybody should have this. Maybe.
And I go as far as to say that everybody should not. It is an abomination, and you will go to hell.
I won't even try it. I'm a picky eater.
I really appreciate the distinction you made there. That it's important for people listening to realize that beliefs and facts, when we're using this approach, that is a distinction that is important to bear in mind when you try and utilize these tools.
Well, it is because when you're exploring a fact claim about reality, it sometimes becomes apparent that the reason or the method that a person is using is unique to them, or they don't even have reasons or methods to get to their conclusion. They think it's true because they want it to be true. It's a personal preference. And because it's my personal preference, I'm justified in thinking that it's factually true. So when somebody wants to surface a claim that's an opinion, it rubs me the wrong way a little bit, because I know that that's an impediment to belief exploration on fact claims. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. In fact, this next question, it kind of bleeds into this this idea, and I wasn't sure whether to ask it, but then I thought, actually, there's kind of a meta quality to it, because
if you're not sure that you should ask it, then you should definitely ask it.
Well, you've got
my view.
On the group, it actually caused a bit of debate, and so perhaps we can discuss it at a meta level and try and answer the actual question. So it's from Isana Anderson, and she says, what doubt can we instill into the woke?
Oh, yeah, I get these very topic-specific questions that it becomes apparent to me that the person asking it has an issue of some sort with that demographic of people. And they're looking for specific advice on how to make progress with them, or maybe in the worst case scenario, destroy them, make them look stupid. And I get responses or queries from people all the time asking for specific advice on a situation that they're in. My sister is going to visit my mom, and my sister has not been vaccinated. What do I do? So it's along the same lines. So forgive me, but I do think it might be useful to go broad here, at least initially. Maybe we can go specific if you want, but all the advice that I would give for that person asking about how do I talk to people who are woke would be the same advice I would give for the person wondering how he should talk to his sister who wants to go visit his mom, which would be the same advice that I would give for somebody that wants to get suggestions on how to talk to their aunt who believes in God and wants to baptize their kids or something like that. All the advice is the same. So, it's a little frustrating to watch people who are into SE get lost on that distinction, and they're letting the sensitivity of the topic impact the slant that they're taking in the conversation. My advice, honestly, would be to take a step back, recognize that you want to have a conversation with somebody who has a position that you potentially disagree with, and you want to understand how they became convinced that it's true. That's all you need. And then it's just a matter of implementing the tools that we've been generating since the books came out and the videos have come out, and just employ the tool. So my advice wouldn't be any different. You may or may not want to reveal your position on it. You probably want to get a sense of their certainty that their claim is true. You want to identify the biggest reason why they think that it's true. Then explore the method that they use to verify the quality of that reason, and then try to end it on a good term where you can meet again. I wouldn't give any other advice.
I think that's, it's a really important observation there, that people sometimes are so animated by a particular...
Sometimes I wonder, though, if people ask questions like that to get a response of, oh, you shouldn't use this approach with that group of people because they're right, or something, or what they're doing is noble, so it's beyond question. Sometimes I wonder if that's what that type of inquiry is meant to solicit, is a reaction from people who think that question is off limits. When the question was, well, how do I engage with them? Well, I gave the answer to how to engage with them. It's no different than any other claim. But I suspect that there's usually something underlying those types of inquiries. They're meant to get a rise out of others. And that's not what we want to do with SE. So I don't want to put words in that person's mouth or say that I know what their motivations were. But that thought does cross my mind. What was the motivation for making this post, and why did it have to be so specific?
Yeah, I guess if I try to give her the benefit of the doubt and go for the charitable interpretation, maybe the question is something like, let's just assume the premise, right? And we're saying that there's this group of people who are incredibly dogmatic about certain identity issues, right? And maybe the metaphysics of their belief system is different from someone who is making a more banal or traditional claim. Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's the same as the religious zealot, and that's what she's getting at. And if that is the case, are there certain things that maybe you wouldn't do or would do? So I'm thinking, again, that example of the dog, the trauma. Maybe if you're discussing trans issues with someone who identifies as trans, there are things that you just don't want to do, right? So maybe that's one way we could answer that if we assume the most charitable interpretation.
That's good advice, is maybe ask yourself before you even have the conversation with the person, is this a topic that they're likely to get defensive or upset about, to the point where they may never want to talk with me again about anything? And if that's the case, you might want to consider exploring other claims that they make besides the potentially sensitive one, for the purpose of demonstrating the technique with them on a claim that's not going to likely perturb them. And then you've also built trust with that person, because you now demonstrated how you would explore a more sensitive topic with them if they allowed you the chance to do so. So sometimes weighting the sensitivity of the topic could be one of the best things. Like, let's say that I really want to talk with this person about this trans issue, but we've argued in the past, and then they didn't like that I posted this one video because it was too confrontational or controversial. Maybe I need to do a little damage control and build up some rapport with them first. That can often go a long way. And you can literally say, I one day I'd really like to talk with you about trans issues, but maybe for the moment we can talk about something a little bit safer. Would that be okay with you? And then you can just go with it. My advice for anyone doing SE is don't hold anything back with what you're doing. You can acknowledge where this technique originated from. You can acknowledge that there's lots of examples online and they just happen to be about God, because this really caught the attention of atheists, but it doesn't have to stay there. You can say, I'd like to ask you questions where I take my own view out of it and really make it all about you, and maybe not even give my position if you're okay with that. Or I can give my position if it's a deal breaker for you, I can give it to you. But I am worried that it might cause you to become more defensive, because now you might know that I disagree with you. So you can lay it all out there and be as honest as possible, and that will bode well for your conversation if they allow you to have it with them.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, this radical humility, radical honesty.
Yeah, right.
Strikes me as very, very similar to like pickup artistry in a way. Yeah, a lot of the techniques in all these movements, there's kind of a cross-fertilization that goes on.
Yeah. I've heard people make comments on my videos like, you must be really good at picking up people, or I've heard this similar recommendation in a pickup artist course or something. So my first reaction would be like, oh gosh, is that really what's happening? But then I'm like, but what we're doing seems like that really does seem to be good advice. I probably don't want to stop using it just because someone might be using it for nefarious purposes. How can I make what we're doing more ethical and better than what it could be used for? And as we're building this course, we're stumbling across these ethical considerations that sometimes we have to stop constructing the course to have a side conversation about the ethical implications of this. How do we want to convey this publicly in a course? Who is the we behind the course? Who are we to say that an SE practitioner should consider this or not consider that? It's a little challenging to codify what we're doing. It's been easy to just roll out there with our cameras and have a conversation. But when you're starting to write it down of like, this is what it is, and this is probably what it isn't, and this is probably what you should be doing, then it gets a little gray. It's a gray thing.
Yeah, well, before we end, one of the things I just wanted to put out there and get your response to was, I'm starting to become less of a fan of this word skepticism, because I feel, along with scientism is actually a boo word. It is used to denigrate, but skepticism, kind of people, since the ancient Greeks, right? They own it. But I feel that, and maybe you shouldn't change terms just because they become loaded and appropriated by the enemy. whoever that is.
Do you think
But
skepticism has been appropriated by the enemy? You think it's been denigrated?
I think that's too. I think that's too strong. But I worry that. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Right, Michael Shermer seems to be. He's I think editor of Skeptic magazine. I've just seen on a few occasions. Don't push me because I can't remember all of them. But on a few occasions, I've just had that quite visceral response of or Mick West with UFOs famously just wanting to shoot it down, and
Yeah.
maybe this gets us into a really nice endgame territory here because an entirely rational world, right? It isn't necessarily, I think, one where you get to keep the merits of curiosity in all of its forms. That religious impulse. Christopher Hitchens famously said that he wouldn't want to get rid of religion because he would have no one left to argue with. And Richard Dawkins couldn't believe this. So maybe that's a bad reason for keeping
Really?
religion around. But I think that in some parts of the skeptic community, they ironically, their default position, that system one process is, well, falsify, and I think that ironic is the right word. It can actually be detrimental to the conversation, to where you're going, to the process, and just your own system of thought. Does that
Sure.
resonate with you?
It does. You mentioned Mick West, and I've been on his podcast, and I love what he's doing. However, I did notice a tweet the other day where it was a map of the world, and overlaid was the number of reports of UFOs, and it was evident that the majority of the activity of UFOs was over the United States. And he basically was saying, like, this is a visual of how a specific demographic can be completely overrun with faulty thinking. I think that was generally what I'm paraphrasing. Now, that's possible. But then again, maybe UFOs are really only hovering over the United States for some reason, right? Like, skepticism could very quickly morph into cynicism to the point of dissuading people from questioning the skeptics. And we don't want to get to that point. So my sense, though, is that if I were to ask Mick if we can explore his tweet a little bit together, he probably would be willing to do it if he was not busy. And I think we'd probably get a much more nuanced view of his position, that he was sort of maybe doing that a little bit tongue in cheek. But we have to be careful about the things that we put out, because it has the potential to put skepticism over everything, including our own ability to check ourselves. And that would be my concern with things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think we definitely do need labels, right? But the lowest common denominator is always a problem, right? How these labels get translated to the masses. I guess veganism has suffered that way, right? It's kind of become synonymous. I don't know if this is the same in the UK, but in the US, but in the UK, it's kind of left-wing, hippie-ish. Not. I think it's growing rapidly, but certainly, prior to maybe like 10 years ago, you would have been put in the same box as the tree hugger, right?
Yeah, I think so.
I think
now nobody would bat an eye really if we went out to dinner and somebody said, I need to see a vegan dish,
exactly,
or where on the menu are the vegan dishes?
Yeah.
Nobody would really get upset by it, unless that person was then making the other people feel bad about their non-vegan choices, perhaps, and that can happen. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about what you're working on at the moment and the future of SE.
Well, almost on a weekly basis, we are releasing review videos, not just myself, but other people who are in the community, where we will take a video. It could be a street epistemology conversation, perhaps, or maybe we want to start showing clips from news interactions that are either good or bad, to point out, like, that was a really good question, or did you see how he asked that question? And just as she was about to give her answer, he asked another question. So we want to start pointing out strengths and weaknesses of human interactions. So watch for that. I mentioned the course already. We're working on the course for street epistemology, which is going to be phenomenal if we can ever finish it. It's going to be it will probably be the premier resource that people will go to eventually to learn street epistemology beyond the videos. And we have a nonprofit called Street Epistemology International that is there to take your donation. If you like what we're doing, we are redirecting funds to people who want to record their conversations, put them online, give a presentation, travel across the country to give talks on this stuff. And we're also interested in finding people who are not satisfied with anecdotes of what we're doing and just taking our word for it that there's something to this is effective, that they want to see it studied. Well, we want to see it studied as well. We are equally as skeptical about what we're doing and the efficacy of it. And well, maybe not as skeptical because we have firsthand experience that it seems to be working, but we want to test it scientifically in some way. And we're interested in having neuroscientists and other scientists study the interactions that we are doing. There's something to it. There seems to be something really profound to it. But we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. We want to be sort of measured in our approach and go slow and steady with this. And I mentioned a couple other things like there's people are taking interest in what we're doing. People like yourself. And here, lastly, we want to move, like this started in the atheist community. We recognized many, many years ago that it shouldn't just stay here. This is a useful tool for everybody, regardless of where you stand. Please don't let the origination of the approach dissuade you from learning more about it. That's all.
Yeah, that is a fallacy.
Mm.
Just to touch on one of the things you said there, the importance of what you're doing, I think, cannot be overstated. We live in incredibly polarized times. One look at the data reveals just how worrying the trends are, but obviously we don't really need to look at the data when people are storming the White House, right? And
pizza parlors and
yeah, and there, as we said at the start of the conversation, there's so much data out there that you can really pick and choose your beliefs and find the justification for them. And as Jonathan Haidt and other psychologists have noted, reasoning always comes second, right? Intuition comes first. That doesn't mean that you can't reason someone out of their beliefs, but the goal shouldn't be to do that, should it? It should always be to try and explore how they got there. And if you can bring them down a couple of points, then often that is the start of the journey. The thing that I wanted to mention specifically is someone interested in moral psychology and research specifically. There is an immense asymmetry often between liberals and conservatives, and when people hear that, they think, "Well, I'm neither. I'm an anarchist or something." I'm talking about the psychological categories, right? So, how you would identify
loyalty,
on something like the big
courage,
five, exactly,
patriotism,
openness, conscientiousness, these measurable traits, right? There is often an immense asymmetry between how, for example, so the biggest asymmetry is in how liberals think of conservatives, traditional conservative opinions, and that might be driven by the media, right, the polarized media, and calling people baskets of deplorables. These comments don't help. Or it could be something more ingrained, or it could be a bit of both. But you would be surprised, or you might not be. You would be amazed, I think, at just how deep the data goes on these asymmetries. And it doesn't often work the other way. Conservatives are quite clued on to the liberal position, and again, that probably is because of the media in the Anglosphere. It's probably quite easy to guess a liberal's position on abortion, whereas a liberal guessing a conservative, they probably, not probably, this is what the data suggests, most of the time they are, they think that conservatives are a lot more rigid than they actually are, right? And there's so much in there that is useful when it's wedded or welded to the street epistemology approach, right? Because if you understand, when you're just looking at the data, that actually, we are polarized, and there is this asymmetry, but the positions are more nuanced than that. Then I think that kind of should encourage you to get out there and explore right? When you're at the Thanksgiving table, to not be confrontational with your racist uncle, as I said in the video.
Right. And it can be really tempting to want to give that back in return if you get it. So if they say, like, if you literally say, I'm a liberal, more than likely they're going to have a picture of what that is, even though there might be a less of a tendency for those on the right, perhaps. Is that what you're saying? The important thing, I think, is to hear people out. Don't assume that you know where they stand on these issues. Don't assume that you know what reasons they'll give for supporting their position. Because if you do that, what will happen is you will likely try to give them information to show that they're wrong on a reason that has no influence whatsoever in their confidence. And they're going to be like wondering, why did they just give me this article about this? That's not even why I think that that's true. And they may be stymied that you thought that they would find that convincing, and it might just show how little you understand them. So it's probably better to just ask people, like, what is it that you think is true? Why do you think it's true? What would change your mind? How would your life be any different if you didn't think that this was true? These are the types of questions that we need to be asking people, and listening, like not going off of the portrayal of what a person who has that view is like, but literally ask them, and they'll appreciate you for it more than likely. And if you're really lucky, they'll use the same approach in return. Because ultimately, this is about getting to the truth of the matter, right? We're evaluating each other's confidence that what we think is true. But the act of doing that, I think, could literally get us potentially closer to the real truth of the matter. So there's real value in productive discourse. And we need to see more examples of it today.
Yeah, that's a lovely place to end. Thank you for coming on and giving so much of your time.
Absolutely, Matt. Thanks for the questions.